Okay, we're up for our next lecture in Unit 3. This one's on Congress. So we're moving into the institutions of the United States government. So Congress, and then we'll talk about the presidency, and then we'll talk about the judiciary. So institutions or the three branches of government. We touched on this lightly when we talked about the Constitution and maybe a tiny bit under federalism. Congress is what I study. I'll try not to go into too much detail in some of these sections, but it's hard for me not to because I've sort of spent over a decade studying these things. But I'm just going to hop right in here. Okay, so just sort of a broad overview of Congress. So what does Congress do? In theory, it occupies a center stage in national policy making. This is not the same as national politics. But policy making. So legislation starts in either the House or the Senate. The president might have ideas for legislation, but the nuts and bolts of putting policy together is something that happens in the legislative branch. Electoral politics clearly influences almost everything members of Congress do collectively and individually. So what I mean by this is members are concerned about getting reelected. So we're coming up, well, actually, I forget the timing on this. As I'm talking, we're coming up on an election, and members are very concerned about getting reelected in November. And that influences what they do. And so when I say individually is easy to describe, when a member of Congress maybe casts a vote or proposes a bill, they're thinking, will this action help me get reelected or hurt me? My chances of getting reelected. So that's individual behavior. Collective is a little different. Collectively, the parties, and when we think of the parties in the legislature, we tend to think of the leaders like Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell. They're mostly concerned about either maintaining their majority in the particular chamber or getting the majority back in the particular chamber. So this is a collective thing because the party collectively is in the majority or the minority. So for example, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, when deciding will the chamber vote on a particular bill, will think, well, voting on this bill and probably passing this piece of legislation in the chamber, will this help the Republicans keep the majority in the Senate or hurt their chances of keeping the majority? And Nancy Pelosi does the same thing. So what happens is you might have a bill that is arguably good for the country. So as an example, a stimulus bill during the coronavirus is probably good for the country. But the different chambers have different ideas about how that will help or hurt their chances in upcoming elections. I think the Democrats, especially in the House, are thinking, you know, like passing a big stimulus package before the election probably will give credit to President Trump. So maybe we don't want to do that. Now, on the other hand, maybe the Senate Republicans are thinking, you know, we pass a big stimulus bill, this will increase the deficit and this will make us look bad. So anyways, that's sort of collective and individual. Basically, individual is individual members' chance of reelection. Collectively is mostly about maintaining the majority or getting the majority. Talk to the majority a bunch. The majority party, through the party leaders, direct and dominate the action in the House and Senate. And the big picture about how they do this is the party leader, so Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, for the most part, they decide what bills get action, what bills get voted on. And that is a key way how you control the chamber. You know, you can talk about what you want, you can have ideas, you can introduce bills, but unless a bill gets a vote, it doesn't matter. So the majority party controls, mostly through the party leaders, what bills actually get a vote. And then the rules and organizational structures, both the Senate and the House adopted, sort of have crucial effect on power, who holds power, and what bills pass. So just real quick, you know, Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker, basically, again, controls the agenda. When I say the agenda, what bills actually get a vote. And that's because the rules are set up that way. The Senate, we have the filibuster. At least it's still a filibuster on legislation. The filibuster is basically gone for nominations and judicial nominees. but that affects things as well. So in the Senate, you might need 60 votes to overcome the filibuster. I think if the Democrats gain control of the Senate, keep the House and the presidency, there's a good chance the filibuster will go away. But the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It's just a rule, something the Senate itself decided they wanted to do. And then the last thing, it's always easier to stop things from happening in Congress than it is to make things happen. Think back to the median voter lecture we just had, because you need to pass the House, the Senate, and the president has to sign the legislation. So there's lots of what we would call veto points to stop a piece of legislation from moving forward. So real quick, some qualification differences. In the House, you only have to be 25. In the Senate, you have to be 30. Most members are much older. The average age in the House and the Senate is well over the average age in the country. Every once in a while, you get a very young representative, but it's usually, that's uncommon. You have to be a citizen to serve in the House and the Senate, 7 years a citizen in the House, 9 years a citizen to be in the Senate, but you don't have to be born in the country, you just have to be a citizen. So none of this sort of natural born question that we have for the presidency. In order to serve in the House and Senate, you have to reside in the state you represent, but you don't have to live in the district. It's hard to win if you don't live in the district, but you don't have to actually live in the district if you're running for the House. Every once in a while, you get these weird, like, does the person actually live there when like their voting address is their, I don't know, their in-laws basement or something, but it helps to live in the district you're going to represent, but you don't have to, you have to live in the state. Okay, so a couple choices, and this is in the Constitution, have effects on electoral politics. So one, members of Congress and the president are elected separately at different times, some of the times. So coming up 2020, all of the House, 435 House members, 1/3 of the Senate, and the president are up for re-election. So what does this mean? This means if we have coattails, if Biden wins the presidency, this will probably be good for Democrats in the House. And there's some of the Senate seats that are the Democrats might pick up. But there's 2/3 of the Senate seats, actually just slightly under 2/3 because there's a special election, that are not up for re-election this time. So those members, they're not up for re-election, and the seats are going to stay in the same party because the same member is going to represent them. But thinking ahead, thinking to maybe 2022, let's say the Democrats maintain the House, they win the Senate, and Biden is president. In 2022, the midterm elections, the whole House is up again, and again, 1/3 of the Senate, but a different third. That's usually bad for the party in power. So we're likely to see in 2022, Democrats lose some seats, assuming they sort of win enough to have control in all three, in the presidency and the House and Senate. So you could have people sort of upset about the president. So this happened in 2018. People weren't happy with President Trump. He's not up for office, but voters punish the party, the president, and the elections they can vote on. So the fact that the president's only 4 years, the House is 2, Senate is every 6 years with 1/3 sort of rotating through, different people might get helped or hurt depending on what's going on, but it might not be their fault, right? They may be sort of be blaming the president, but they're going to punish other candidates. And this was deliberate. Part of this is the idea is to pass legislation or have majorities. You need to win successive elections, right? So the framers were concerned about like the whims of the people. So they wanted it, you had to win these successive elections in order to have a working majority over the long term. Then the other thing is members of Congress are elected by plurality vote. So that means whoever gets the most votes wins. In some states, you actually need a majority and they'll have a runoff if none of the candidates get majority, but plurality just means the most. Either plurality or majority, it's different from proportional. So some other countries elect their members via proportional representation. In the proportional representation countries, You generally vote by a party, and then the seats in the legislature are distributed by basically the percent of the vote that the party got. So in a PR system, if a party got 25% of the votes, they get 25% of the seats. In our system, plurality, you could conceivably win, I don't know, 51% of the vote in all 435 House districts, and you get 100 of the seats. So there's a couple effects of this plurality system. Is one, the sort of the percent of the vote in the electorate doesn't necessarily mimic the percent of the vote or the percent of the seats held by a party in the legislature. And then it also encourages two parties rather than multiple parties. So, you know, if you're in favor of a candidate, but they're a third party candidate, they might only be getting, you know, 20% of the vote, you're effectively throwing your vote away in terms of voting for someone who can actually hold the seat. So we'll talk about this more in the parties chapter that I think isn't actually even 4, but our plurality system encourages two parties instead of multiple parties that you might get in a PR system. So yeah, congressional elections are every 2 years, all 435 House seats. We currently have 232 Democrats in the House, 197 Republicans, 1 Libertarian. It's Justin Amash from Illinois. If you're on Twitter, I recommend following him. I think he's like very interesting. He's very good at explaining how he votes. And he engages fairly well. A Republican, and then he decided he couldn't be anymore, became a Libertarian, and then he's going to lose. So this is his last term. And then we have 5 vacancies. So either I think there might have been 1 death, a couple people joined the Trump administration, and then I don't know, maybe someone ran for another office. And occasionally someone resigns for a scandal. So there's 5 vacancies in the chamber. 1/3 of the Senate seats are up. And currently we have 45 Democrats, 53 Republicans, and 2 independents from Vermont and Maine here are our independents. Now, something about having only 1/3 of the seats up, sometimes one of the parties is defending more seats than the other, depending on which of the seats are up. So this year is quote unquote a bad year for Republicans because they have to defend a lot of seats. So it's hard to sort of gain seats if you already have them. So Republicans have to defend a bunch of seats that they're the ones that they're currently in incumbents. The Democrats are trying to flip them. Okay, so in the House, members represent districts. Districts are geographic boundaries that sort of define a particular area. Boundaries have to be contiguous. So, you know, you can't have part of a district over here and part over here if they're not connected. And then districts have to have the same number of people. And we'll talk about the census in a little bit more about the census in a second. So after the 1790 census, there was 1 seat for every 33,000 inhabitants. That gave us 105 seats in the first Congress. Actually, the second Congress, the first one was like before the census, so they sort of just guessed at what they had. Then they had the 1790 census, and we got 105. If we followed this ratio of 33 inhabitants per seat, we would have 9,000 seats today, which is a little unreasonable. There's like a push to increase the size of the House. I'm kind of against that. I see the number one problem with the House of Representatives today is members aren't allowed to vote on the legislation that they want to vote on because of the structure of the leadership, the very centralized leadership structure. I don't see how we can both increase the size of the chamber and decentralize the leadership structure. Anyways, that's all I'll say about that. But I'm sort of against that idea. I don't know what it solves. In 1911, they fixed the size of the House at 435 members. This is just by law. It's not in the Constitution or anything. All it would take is another law, and they could increase the size of the House to whatever they want. They could decrease it too. The mean size of a district is about 700,000 representatives. There's actually there's a huge variation. One, because of population growth. So after the census, they redistribute, I'll talk about more of this, they redistribute the districts. And so the last time they did this was after the 2010 census, so basically in 2011 or 2012. So over time, those districts change in size based off of population growth or decline. So the range now of the size of these districts are from almost 1 million to 500,000. And part of the 500,000 is every state gets at least one representative. I should say, I said the districts have to be equal in population. That's within a state. So all the districts in Oklahoma, after they redraw the districts after the 2020 census, will be the same in population. But they might be slightly different from the districts in Texas, because you can't have the same size across the states, right? Because there's different numbers of people in the states. You have to divide it somehow. But within the state, they have to be equal. The seats are based off of population. After they do the census, they determine how many people we have. They use this formula. If you want to follow this link, you can sort of study the formula. This is called apportionment. So apportioning the congressional districts. And as I said, like there's a fair amount of variation. Rhode Island currently, and so in 2020 or 2020 estimate, has 1.059 million people, and they actually have 2 members of the House of Representatives. Montana now has 1.068 million people. They only have 1 seat, because that was these seats, 2 and 1, were based off of the 2010 census. And these numbers, 1.59 and 1.068 million, are based off of a sort of an estimated population. So, Rhode Island actually has fewer people in Montana, but has more representation. But that'll change after the 2020 census. I think most of Montana is people leaving California, because it's so expensive to live in California. People are leaving and they're moving to places like Montana and Wyoming and whatnot. And then people are leaving Rhode Island because the taxes are high. So every 10 years, we have the census. Again, we're sort of in the middle of this now. It's an actual enumeration. What that means is they have to actually count people. They can't estimate. I mentioned these numbers, 1.59, 1.059, 1.068 are estimates. So they do estimates. But the actual census that they use to determine the number of congressional districts, that's based on an actual count. So maybe you filled out the form, or actually, if you lived in the dorms, the university fills out the form automatically. If you're off campus, one should have been mailed to you. So you fill it out and they just count everyone up. Turns out it'd actually be more accurate to make an estimate than an actual enumeration. And this is because of things like undercounts, which is missing people, and overcounts, which is counting people twice. Classic undercounts are maybe homeless population. So trying to count homeless population might be hard because there's no place to send the form to. Now, I should say they send out census takers who might be familiar with the homeless population to count. So they try their best. States want every person counted because not only is representation based off of the census, there's all sorts of federal funding formulas that are just based off of people. So if you miss counting people, you might get less money in federal programs. So undercounts are people you miss. Overcounts are people you count twice. The actual classic example of overcounts are college students. So I said if you lived in the dorm, the university actually automatically fills out a form and says, here's how many students live in the dorm. But your parents also get the form. And on the form, it asks, like, how many people live here? And your parents are like, well, there's, I don't know, maybe both your parents. And then they're like, okay, we have 1 kid. They look, they see a kid. And they're like, well, I have a kid in college, but the kid lives here. But they might not. They live in the dorm. So your parents might count you too. So you're counted twice. For some of you, that may mean being counted in Texas and also counted in Oklahoma. So your parents shouldn't. You're supposed to be counted where you spend most of the time. So you live in the dorms, you're in the dorms for most of the time, and you're back home, maybe in your parents' house, only for some of the time, like maybe just the summer. So your parents shouldn't count you at home. You should get counted here. That's an overcount. And then also, like, the census is super inaccurate because they miss people. But also, like, people are born, people die over the course of the year that the census takes place. So it's actually not a super accurate count, but that's what we use. Looking back to the 2020 census, this is a map of states that lost districts and states that gained districts. So these orange states lost and the blue gained. So where are your losses? They're kind of here in the Northeast and through the Rust Belt here. And then Louisiana, this is probably a result of Hurricane Katrina, probably, and people left into Texas. So here's your losses through the Northeast. New York has been consistently losing seats. And then where do you pick up? I don't know, the South, the Sun Belt, whatever you want to call these states, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, Nevada, Utah, and then up in Washington too, have been gaining seats. Here's a projection for 2020. It looks kind of similar, I guess. Northeast still losing, so New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Michigan, Illinois are losing. And then gains are through the South, although a little bit more concentrated in slightly different states. So Florida gaining, Texas gaining, but now we have Colorado and Montana and Oregon are gaining. And so some of these like Western gains are people leaving California. California may actually lose a seat and move into some of these other states. And then some of it is through immigration. And then some of it is through births. So we actually probably have fewer births here in the Northeast and more in the South. So we'll see if this holds up. This is just a projection. We'll find out, I guess. Okay, so I said before, the districts within a state have to be the same size in terms of population. This was not always the case. This is a result of a 1964 sort of series of court rulings that said congressional districts and state legislative districts have to be equal. There's a little more wiggle room on state districts. What was happening is we were seeing unequal representation. So what we had rural districts with small populations and urban districts with large populations. So the classic example of this is the state of Georgia. So you might have the city of Atlanta, which was really big, would get one member of Congress. But then you might have some rural part of Georgia that had a small population that also had one representative. And so the net result is the people in the rural parts with small populations were overrepresented in the Congress. And then the urban districts with large populations were underrepresented. Why did they let this happen? Mostly because of racism, right? So these urban districts were less white. And so the people who draw the districts were like, well, let's give more representation to the rural white population and less representation to the urban non-white population. So these court cases in 64, Reynolds v. Sims, this is the state legislative boundaries, and then Westbury v. Sanders, the House, US House boundaries. So they have to be equal in terms of population, and we get the term one person, one vote. I don't know about you, when I think of one person, one vote, I think this is fundamental to sort of democracy in the US. It is relatively recent. So 1964 is, I don't know, before I was born, but still like relatively recent. It's not like, Abraham Lincoln, or not Abraham Lincoln, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson came up with one person, one vote that came from the 60s. So these cases got us equality of representation in terms of districts. If districts vary, especially for the House of Representatives, by even a handful of people, you could sue and you could probably win and say these districts aren't fair and they would have to redraw the districts. You get a little bit more leeway in state legislative districts, but very little leeway in congressional districts or House representative districts. Obviously the Senate is a totally different beast. So what does this do? If you have to have these equal sized districts, is you force to divide what is called communities of interest. So Oklahoma City is bigger than 700,000. So you split it into, in this case, into two districts. So Tom Cole sort of has the southernish part, sort of, and then Kendra Horn has the northernish part of Oklahoma City. And you divide it because you need equal population. You can make I think, an argument that like, well, we'd rather just have one representative for Oklahoma City and just get the core Oklahoma City because they might do a better job of representing it. But if the district is, 1 million people large, well, with one member, and then that leaves us with a rural district, like maybe out in the Panhandle that has 500,000 people. The rural district is effectively overrepresented. And they actually used to draw the Oklahoma districts that way. You had some rural ones that were small, and then Tulsa and Oklahoma City were big in terms of population, but up until 64, then they couldn't do that anymore. So after the census, we reapportioned the districts. I said that already. This process is very political, as you can imagine, because drawing the lines basically determines which party represents that district. Sort of, it nudges it very much in one direction or another. And I'll show some examples about controlling the redistricting process and the districts you get and the outcomes you can get. So in most states, drawing districts is done by the state legislature and the boundaries are approved by the governor. So think of it like a bill that has to go through the state legislature. If the state can't get it done, usually by a deadline, the courts might step in. I think actually Oklahoma has, if the state legislature can't get it done by a deadline, we have like a commission that somehow steps up and does it. So every state varies a little bit. Some states, California, now I think Michigan, Idaho, Hawaii use nonpartisan commissions. Some other states have other kinds of commissions too. Sorry, those states I just named are independent, and some use maybe nonpartisan. When you take the redistricting process out of the legislature, you tend to get districts that are more competitive and, I don't know, look better. And I put that in quotes because like there's whole debates about like what districts look like and whatnot. But anyways, when it's very political, when it's done by the legislature, you might get one outcome. And when it's done by these commissions, you might get a different outcome. And there's lots of different kinds of commissions. Some are not partisan, some are independent, some are somewhere in between, but lots of variations. Just here's the current set of congressional districts. This yellow, that's just an AMOSH, that are Libertarian. Blue is Democrats. Red is Republicans. So there's Kendra Horn in Oklahoma. I think the gray ones are probably vacancies. Yeah, that's right. So what do you get? Like for the most part, we have blue on the coast, blue in the cities, and red everywhere else. It's not perfect, but that's about what you get. Here's the Oklahoma districts. So 5 is Kendra Horn, 4 is Tom Cole. Lucas is 3. I think Mark McMullen is 1 and Hearn is 2. I think I have that right. But these are the districts. So kind of a Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and then 3 of the more rural-ish ones, with 3 and 2 being the most rural. Some examples of gerrymandered districts. This is called the Praying Mantis District. I don't know, kind of, I don't really see it. This is called the Goofy Kicking Donald Duck District. It's totally there, right? There's Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. I don't know. This one's probably changed because they were forced to redistrict in Pennsylvania because the districts were not legal. Okay, so what's gerrymandering? You probably heard the term gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is line drawing to maximize seats for one party or a group. So we can have partisan gerrymandering, we might have racial gerrymandering, where you're sort of drawing districts to elect a particular racial group or not elect a particular racial group. Some different techniques for gerrymandering. One is cracking, and that is to split an area of partisan strength among several districts. It makes it hard for a party to win. So for example, if you wanted to do cracking, you might have, say, an urban area that's very Democratic. If you were to crack that area, you would take that urban area, maybe it's, and you put a little bit of the Democratic voters into one district and a little bit of the Democratic voters into another district, and what's left into another district. And so you might take an area that was, I don't know, like 80% Democratic. And so maybe you're going to put 20% in a Republican district, 25% in another Republican district, that leaves you with a little bit left to put in another Republican district. And so you can put them into districts that will be, take these Democratic strength, put a little bit in each of the Republican districts. Those Republican districts remain majority Republican. And so you've diluted sort of the voting strength of the Republicans, or sorry, of the Democrats. So that's cracking. So I think, I'm gonna guess, after the census, we're gonna have to redistrict in Oklahoma. They're gonna take the district that Kendra Horn represents, and they're gonna crack that up into some other Republican districts and make it harder for a Democrat to win. So that's one technique. The other main technique is packing. And so packing is, what you do is you take as many partisans as possible and jam them into a district so you can waste the votes. So classic packing would be like, well, let's take this urban area that's much more Democratic, and let's make this district 80% Democratic. So that way, okay, you're like, Democrats going to win, but you've effectively wasted all those Democratic votes. That leaves the rest of the state Republican. So that Oklahoma City, there were so many Democrats that could live in that city, that there's going to be a Democratic representative from that area. You would pack as many Democrats together, again, and have a district that's maybe like 80% Democratic, and then that leaves the rest of the Oklahoma as a Republican. So that happens as well. And what that does is it wastes votes. So cracking splits, dilutes voting strength. Packing puts people together, and that wastes votes. Both are perfectly legal for the most part, as long as you don't take race into account when you draw these districts. That's legal. So diluting, like, voters taking race into account, can be illegal. So different outcomes that we get. So that this packing and cracking and our techniques, these are outcomes. So some outcomes from redistricting are partisan gerrymander. And so we're going to see this in Oklahoma. We would also see it in a state controlled 100% by the Democrats. So one party controls all of the state government, try to win as many seats as possible for that party. This is legal and it's risky. So the Supreme Court basically has said, like, they're not going to rule over partisan gerrymandering cases. It's perfectly legal if you're just taking party into account in most states. As long as the state constitution doesn't say you can't do it, then it's legal. So Oklahoma, this is perfectly legal. So they're gonna the Democrats will control the House and the Senate and the governorship here in the state. And they're gonna try to draw as many districts as possible, so Republicans can win as many as possible. Again, legal, risky, and sort of time-honored technique. Sometimes an outcome is an incumbent protection plan. And under incumbent protection plan, basically all the incumbents return to office. So you don't change the districts all that much. And this is usually an outcome when the state government is divided. So you can imagine a state where maybe the Democrats control the state House, the Republicans control the state Senate, and I don't know, it doesn't really matter who controls the governorship. Like, they're not going to agree on a plan that really hurts one party or another. So what do? They're like, well, let's just maintain the status quo. All the incumbents can return to office. And you end up having a whole bunch of safe incumbents. So you're probably wasting votes. It's safe, again, also perfectly legal. Oh, I should say, partisan gerrymander, the reason it's risky is you can imagine drawing a series of districts that were, say, 51% Republican at the time you drew them. That doesn't guarantee those people will continue to vote that way in the future. So if you had a big partisan wave that goes against you, you might end up losing a bunch of seats because they were very narrow. They were drawn as a very narrow majority to maximize the number of seats that you want to win. So that's what makes the partisan gerrymander risky. Okay, so we're going to walk through some examples of gerrymandering. And so this is why it's so important to control the process. So here we have a state. It's a nice square Midwestern state. Each letter is a voter. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 25 voters here, but 15 of them are Republicans and 10 of them are Democrats. So there's overwhelming, well, not maybe overwhelming, there's a Republican majority in the state. So we're going to draw some districts. Remember the rules. The districts have to be equal in size. So each district has to have 5 letters or voters. And then they have to be contiguous. So you can't take like 3 Republicans over here on the top left and then 2 Democrats in the bottom right, because it's not contiguous. Okay, so before redistricting, let's say the Republicans were in charge and they had a 3-2 advantage in the congressional delegation. So maybe states, the districts look like this. So we have the top 3 districts are Republican, the bottom 2 are Democratic districts. So that's what the status quo looks like. Now somehow the Democrats won some elections, they control the state legislature and the governorship, and they want to gain an advantage. So remember before, they were down 3-2. We have the state that clearly has a Republican advantage to it, right? 15 Republicans, 10 Democrats. Is there a way to draw the districts so the Democrats actually get a majority of the seats? So hit pause, take your finger on the screen, and draw some districts. See if you can do it. So pretend you hit pause. Look, now we're back. And so we'll draw some districts, and we'll use the techniques, packing and cracking, that we learned about. So Democrats are drawing some districts. What are they going to do? They're going to pack the Republicans into one district, pack these Republicans into another district. So that's 2 Republican districts. Now they're thinking, can we draw 3 Democratic districts? Answer, yes. So there's 1 Democratic district, right? 5 letters in it, but 3 are Ds. And there's another one, 5 letters, 3 Ds, and another one, 4 Ds and 1 Republican. So this is a state that the voter registration or whatever is, 3-2 Republican, but the Democrats can draw seats such that they actually get more of the congressional districts. So this is one reason why controlling that process is so important. And you could argue this sort of goes against like the will of the people or something like that. So some people say this is unfair, maybe, but it's legal. So fairness doesn't really come into play here. So they get their 3-2. Okay, so let's start again. Republicans have 3-2. So this is the original status quo. Now they control the legislature again, and they want a bigger lead. So they had 3-2 before. Can they get 5? Right? Answer, yes. Okay, so we'll pause again and draw some districts so the Republicans get them all. We'll pretend you just did that. And here we go. All right, so it's pretty easy. How do you get 5? Just draw these lines. So we have 5 districts that are 3-2 Republican. So before they had 3, now they have 5. Same state. This is a little risky, right? What happens if some of these R's flip? Maybe new people move to the district. Maybe, I don't know, someone changes their mind because they don't like the president. And they vote a different way. So it's a little risky because the majority advantage is small, but there it is. Okay, so that's the House. Senate, no redistricting, no districts because they're states. They don't change, but they're like vastly different in terms of population, right? California has almost 40 million people, 12% of the population of the country, but they have 2 senators. Wyoming, just over 500,000 people, 1 House seat, 2 senators. So we worry so much about equal population in the House, and then we get to the Senate, we're like, just kidding, we don't care about here. And that's sort of by design, but sort of, I guess. But that's what we have. So why do we care about this? We care about this because of the way majority coalitions are formed. So basically in the US, small states are over-advantaged in terms of policy. So, imagine you're trying to make a coalition. So what do you need in the Senate? You need 51 votes, maybe 60, depending on what you're doing. And say I'm California, and we're dividing up some amount of like transportation money or something. And I'm trying to get a coalition. So what that means is I want to get people to vote for a bill in California. And I'm like, okay, we have some amount of money to divide up for transportation, and I need to get some votes. You can effectively think about like you're buying votes, right? You're not really giving money to the senators, but the states are getting it. So if you're, this senator from Wyoming, you're gonna be like kind of cheap to buy. You don't need a lot of money in order to like pay for transportation in your state compared to, a state like Texas, right? So say Wyoming, you're like, okay, you get $1 billion for transportation, and Wyoming's like, oh, that's kind of a lot of money. I'm on board, right? I'll vote with you, California. But if California said Texas, you get $1 billion for transportation. Texas is like, that pays for like 2 miles of roads in, Houston or something. Like, we're out, we're against. So what happens is smaller states basically get more money than they should because of the Senate. And there's probably some other policy things that work out, but the money thing is a good example. And the way to think about that is like these smaller states are like basically easier to buy off. And it's not illegal, right? It's not corruption, right? Because these are laws that everyone votes on. And again, the senator is not pocketing the money. It's money that goes to the states. But because of the Senate, smaller states are advantaged in the policymaking world. Here's the current Senate. So blue are 2 Democratic senators, red 2 Republican senators, purple is a mix. And then there's our independents in Maine and Vermont. So I don't know. Looks about how you'd expect it to look. The coasts are blue, Northeast blue, red through the middle. We got our, sort of unusual mixed delegation from Mississippi because of that special election we had when the Republicans ran the guy who chased after young women. Anyways, there's the current Senate. These are the races that are up for office. So I think if I'm looking at it right, so this is the election, what seats are up for election. There's more Republican seats up for election, quote unquote Republican seats. They don't own them, but ones that they're incumbents in. And it's almost all these states, just one of the senators is up for election. Georgia's having a special election, so there's actually 2. But for the most part, it's just 1. And so the Republicans are having to defend more of these seats. So that gives an opportunity for Democrats to pick up. There's only so many Democrats that can lose here. Like I'm guessing the Democrats will lose Mississippi, but they'll probably hold everything else. So that's why it's going to be a little easier for the Democrats to take the Senate now. If we were to look ahead at 2022, you probably see more blue states up for re-election. Okay, so parties, national politics and parties are an important part of elections. If you've watched any of these Kendra Horn or Stephanie Bice ads, they're trying to tie Kendra Horn to Nancy Pelosi and the socialist Democrats. Kendra Horn is not a socialist. There's some kind of socialist in the Democratic Party. Kendra Horn is not. But national politics play a big part of congressional elections, right? So the Democrats are running on sort of against Trump and pro-healthcare. The Republicans, I'll be honest, I think at this point, it looks good for the Democrats. The Republicans might be running away from Trump a little bit, maybe focusing on judges. It's not to say local politics don't matter, but national politics do come into play a lot, and a lot of that is focused on the president. But also focused on things like the economy, right? That's a national thing. The coronavirus is a national thing. If we're at war, that's a national thing. Local things matter too. Yeah, so that's before the congressional candidates do better when their party's presidential candidate wins, and we call this coattail effects. These used to be much bigger, where maybe the Democrats under like Lyndon Johnson sweep into office. Johnson's popular when he wins, and the Democrats pick up a lot of seats in the legislature. Coattail effects, we see them less now. Again, it looks like Biden's going to win. You don't really know what's going to happen. That's going to help Democrats a little bit, but we're not going to see, like, I don't think, lots of Democrats being swept in because Biden's so popular. Because I don't think he's super popular. But we call that a coattail effect. So it gets swept in with your party. But on the flip side, in the midterm election, so the president's not up for re-election, just the House and 1/3 of the Senate, the president's party almost always loses congressional seats because people are not happy with the president for some reason. And the sort of two things that matter here. There's more than two. The two most important are the economy and the popularity of the president. So a good economy and a popular president, the president's party in the House and Senate might do okay, might maybe lose a couple seats, but if the economy's bad or the president's really unpopular, they're going to lose a bunch of seats. So, Trump wasn't popular in 2018. The Democrats were able to pick up a number of seats. So what do members care about in their actions when they're in the chamber? Because they want to get reelected, they're usually thinking short term rather than long term. They're thinking, what are projects that are narrowly targeted that are going to help my district rather than maybe big picture things that'll help the country. So, there might be things that are good for the country in the long run, but might not help a particular member for their district, so they might be against that. And then because members are, for the most part, worried about short term, they're less concerned about spending or revenue, right? Like, do you run up a deficit? Who cares? Republicans, and to some extent Democrats, when they don't hold the majority, are worried about deficits. But when they're in the majority, they don't really care. Right? The Republicans under Trump passed a big tax cut without reducing spending. So, we're going to run up a big deficit, and that translates into the debt. If the Democrats or the Republicans sort of lose the presidency in the Senate, they're going to start to worry about the deficit a little bit. And Democrats do it a little bit, but not quite as much. So what do? We pass big spending bills and we don't pay for them. Okay. So how do we organize Congress? There's two important structures, institutional structures, and one is the party system, and we'll talk about that. And one is the committee system. Right now, I think the party system is way more important than the committee system. Over time, these have ebbed and flowed. We went back a period of time like 1920 to like 1970, 75. The committee system is more important and the party system less so. But now the party system dominates and committees are less important. So what's the party system? It's mostly the leadership. And so in the House, the majority is led by the Speaker, and this is a constitutional office. It's Nancy Pelosi, she's from California. It's actually one of the few leadership positions that's listed in the Constitution. So the Speaker of the House is one, and then the President pro tem in the Senate is the other one, but the pro tem doesn't really matter. So Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. Her biggest power is control over what gets a vote. So she controls the Rules Committee. She has some assistants, Steny Hoyer from Maryland, and then James Clyburn from South Carolina. All three of these people are over 70, so the leadership is extremely old in the House. Capable, probably. Old, yes. Pelosi is very shrewd, and I think she's a good speaker at getting the best out of her membership. On the House side, we have Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and then there's also Minority Whip, that's Steve Scalise from Louisiana. McCarthy's from California. They don't really do much. They don't really have any real powers, I guess. Mostly just holding press conferences. In the Senate, the Vice President is the presiding officer of the Senate. So that's it's in the Constitution too. But never really does it, except if there's a tie. That's usually the only time the Vice President is in the Senate doing anything for real. Then there's the Constitution calls for President pro tem, that according to the Constitution presides when the Vice President is absent by rule. This is the longest serving member from the majority party, and that's Grassley here from Iowa. When I say preside, he doesn't actually, you can sort of tell anyone can sort of sit up in the chair. So it's not like Grassley's always up there with the gavel. The real leadership in the Senate is the majority leader and the minority leader. The majority leader right now is Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. The minority leader is Chuck Schumer. The power that the majority leader has is what we call the right of first recognition. So in order to like make motions, you have to be called upon. And so whenever the majority leader wants to be called upon, sort of, he gets picked and gets to make motions. If there was a majority that wanted to do things that McConnell didn't want, they could block him, but there usually isn't. And then Chuck Schumer, minority leader, like again, doesn't really have any formal powers. Both these positions, majority leader, minority leader, are not in the Constitution and really are like not formalized until about 1913. Okay, so that's the party structure. And again, like the real power of the party structure is determining what gets a vote in the legislature. The other institution is committees, and committees in like the cartoon world of Congress is where like the work gets done to write legislation and so on and so forth. In reality, a lot of the work now to write legislation gets done by the party as well. There's just less work that gets done in these committees. So what are the committees? Again, in theory, we take the legislative agenda, so all the things that need to be worked on, and we divide it up into different areas. So there might be a committee on appropriations, that's spending money, a committee on agriculture, a committee on Veterans Affairs. So we take these things that have important policy, and then there's a committee that deals with the legislation. So that provides an incentive if you're on the committee from year to year to specialize in that area. And then you probably want to serve on a committee that'll help your reelection chances. So if you're from Oklahoma and we have a lot of agriculture here, you might want to be on the agriculture committee, or you might want to be on a defense committee. And members from our state are on those two committees because we do a lot of work in that area. There's a lot of jobs in that area. So we have standing committees, and those exist from one Congress to the next. Most of the committees are standing committees, and so you stay on that. Usually, you get appointed to a committee early on in your first year as a member, and you tend to stay on that committee for your however long you serve until you can be on a better one. So if you originally get appointed to a good one, you stay on it. But usually your first appointment's not to good committees, I guess. There's a bunch that are like just less important, like small business tends to be not very important. So if you have a chance to move to a better one, you do it. So yeah, committees have fixed jurisdiction, stable membership, and that facilitates specialization. So what it means is provides an incentive to learn more about that topic. So if you're on the agriculture committee, you're going to spend a lot of time learning about agricultural policy. Again, if you're from Oklahoma, that's a good thing to do because maybe a lot of your constituents work in agriculture or maybe oil and gas. So, you want to get on a committee that's going to help your constituents, and you want to learn a lot about that topic. Committees have staff who can also help. So, it's not the members doing all this work. Most committees are divided into subcommittees. So, like agriculture might be the big topic, but then there might be other parts of agriculture that are smaller policy topics. So we divide the big committee into subcommittees. Excuse me. On all the committees except for ethics, the majority party has a majority of the seats in those committees. The chair of the committee is from the majority party. So the majority party controls the committees. Both essentially the chair of the committee and then kind of like they have more votes than the other party. There. Okay, how does a bill become law? The rules really matter. Take a legislative process class if you want to learn more about the rules. We'll go into some of them. Basically, the one rule that matters is majority rules. So in both of the chambers, if a majority wants to do something, they can. Now, I know you're thinking in the Senate, we have the filibuster. If a majority of the members in the Senate wanted to do away with the filibuster, they can. You don't need 60 votes to do away with the filibuster. And you sort of change it via precedent. I'm not going to get into it, but in both chambers, if a majority want to do something, they can get it done. It's not to say the minority members don't have rights, but if majority can win the votes they need to win, they can do what they want, including changing the rules. So, people are like, oh, you're changing the rules in midstream or whatever. Like, the rules allow them to do that. I have a longer rant, but I won't do it. Opponents have lots of opportunities to sidetrack or kill legislation because you have to win a series of votes in order for a bill to become law. So even in one chamber, it's not just one vote. You have to win a whole bunch. And we'll get into it. Most legislation becomes law, moves at this concurrently, but probably at different speeds through both chambers. So again, like the cartoon version of I'm Just a Bill, I'll put it up on the page or whatever. It has like the bill starts in the House and it goes through committee and then it passes the chamber. Then it moves over to the Senate. Like kind of works that way, but like it doesn't have to. So you can have similar bills move through at the same time. There's things you can do to like combine those together in a way. Okay, so the process starts basically the same in both chambers. So introduction in both chambers, only members can introduce legislation. You try to get co-sponsors for the legislation. So there's an original sponsor and you might try to get people to basically co-sponsor, say like, okay, I like this bill, I'm attaching my name to it. Then bills get assigned to committee and then to subcommittee. And so they get assigned to committee based off of the area. So a bill about farming gets assigned to the Agriculture Committee, a bill about taxes gets assigned to Ways and Means Committee, and so on and so forth. And then usually, more so in the House, goes to subcommittee. Again, I'm sort of talking through like the cartoon version, like the real process might be way more messy than this, but this is not a class on the legislative process. It's an introduction to political science class. Okay, so assigned to committees and then subcommittees, the whole hearings where they have experts come and testify, they mark up the legislation. So your original bill might get introduced and like, well, let's change the bill, that's markup. Then they have a vote at subcommittee and the committee level. So you need to pass the vote at the subcommittee level and you need to pass a vote at the committee level. And most bills actually don't even get a hearing. So most bills get introduced, assigned to committee, and then they die. That's it. So you get assigned to committee and then subcommittee, you have hearings, you have markup, you vote at subcommittee, and you might have hearings and markup again at the full committee level, then another vote. You can pass those two hurdles. Then you move out of committee and you might potentially get a vote on the floor. So the beginning is pretty similar across the House and the Senate. And this is where it starts to change, is scheduling debate. So assuming you make it out of committee, there's ways to force bills out of committee too, but again, we're not going to go down that path. In the House, the way you schedule debate, when I say schedule debate, that also means schedule a vote on the bill because the two go together. The bill goes to what's called the Rules Committee to receive a rule. So we can imagine a couple different ways of the way a legislature can operate. And if you were to think about this in the simplest way, you would say, okay, once a bill gets out of committee, it gets a vote on the floor and it just goes in order, right? Like, well, this bill came out of committee first, so this one gets a vote. This bill came out of committee second, so this one gets a vote second. This is a terrible way to do things because what if the second bill that comes out of committee is really important and timely and the first one is not? So we have the Rules Committee and that says, okay, here's a whole series of bills that are out of committee. When are we going to vote on a particular bill? How long will we debate it? Are amendments allowed, right? So can you change the bill on the floor? And those sorts of things. So let's say a bill comes out of the Agriculture Committee, it goes to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee, if they want, will say, okay, this bill came out of committee. Next Tuesday, we're going to vote on this bill from the Agriculture Committee. We're going to debate it for an hour. And we're going to allow 2 amendments. The Republicans can offer an amendment and the Democrats can offer an amendment. And then we'll vote on the bill. So we'll have our debate, we'll have our amendments, and then we vote on the bill. That'll be a special rule, right? Those things. When is it going to get a vote? How long is the debate? And are there amendments allowed? That rule itself actually has to be voted on. So the chamber has to decide, we agree to this particular set of rules for this particular bill. If you're voting on a rule, it almost always has a majority line vote. And the majority party almost always passes the rules. So if you don't pass the rule, that's bad. I'll just leave it at that. If the Rules Committee, and the Speaker controls the Rules Committee, so the Speaker appoints the members to the Rules Committee. And if you want to stay on the Rules Committee, you vote how the Speaker wants you to vote. So this is the real power of the Speaker, is controlling this Rules Committee. If the Rules Committee, like let's say a bill gets out of a regular committee, Again, our agricultural bill comes out of the ag committee. The speaker's like, I don't like that bill. That's it, it won't get a vote. She'll tell the rules committee, don't give it a rule. It doesn't get a rule, it won't get a vote. So special rule in the House says, when is a bill going to get a vote? If and when a bill will get a vote, how long it's debated, and which amendments are allowed, if any are allowed. Rules committee can even do things like, okay, again, our bill comes out of the agricultural committee. The speaker's like, that bill is okay, but I like a version of it different. They can say, we're going to allow, we're actually going to, before it even comes to the floor, we're going to take the bill that came out of committee and we're going to substitute it with this other bill, and we'll vote on that. Again, I'm like waving my hands. There's kind of things that happen in between there, but the speaker can basically substitute a different bill in there on the same topic. Still has to get a majority vote, but again, she's deciding what gets a vote and what doesn't get a vote. So here's a rules committee. Senate is a little different. The Senate doesn't use a rules committee to schedule debate. They can schedule debate in two ways. One is through a unanimous consent agreement where every member in the chamber, so unanimous, all 100, agree on how long we're going to debate something, which amendments are allowed, and some other things. So if one person objects, this unanimous consent agreement, or UCA, isn't going to work. Our current Senate rarely uses UCAs on any legislation that's even vaguely important. Excuse me. You want to do something like name a post office, you can do it through a UCA. Most legislation now has to get a 3/5 majority, so 60 votes, to do what's called invoking cloture. So basically the majority leader says, I'm going to offer a motion to proceed on this particular bill, and then you need 60 votes to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed. And so legislation needs 60 votes to get to that final vote. So you invoke cloture, and then you might vote on some amendments, and then you vote on the bill. So you could actually have 60 votes for cloture and only majority to pass the bill, and that's fine. Occasionally members flip on the cloture vote versus the final passage vote. What doesn't require this cloture and 60 votes now is nominations, which includes judges. And then there's some budget things like budget reconciliation. And we haven't asked the expert on filibuster, so you can turn to that for more on filibuster. So just sort of real quick, in the House, so it's just similarities and differences here. These always make a good question. Time for debate is equally divided between people for and against the bill. And amendments have to be germane or relevant to the bill. In the Senate, debate is equally divided. Fun fact, under some rules, on some occasions, amendments actually don't have to be germane. So you can have amendments to a bill that like totally change the bill. So you can imagine, again, our mythical farming bill here, and someone says, I'm going to offer an amendment about abortion. Then all of a sudden the bill is like kind of about abortion and not about farming anymore. I give an example. There was a credit card reform bill that was being passed, and someone offered an amendment about bringing guns in national parks to the bill. So since people are really pro or against Second Amendment, now this credit card reform bill is kind of about guns in national parks. Fun fact, it passes, you're allowed to bring guns into national parks, but I think it's actually still illegal to fire said gun in national parks. It's totally different in like grasslands and other places, but in national parks, I think it's illegal to fire a gun. So we have a series of votes in both chambers, some procedural votes and maybe amendments, and then the bill. The same exact bill has to eventually pass both chambers. So if a slightly different bill passes the House than the Senate, they have a couple options. Well, one is do nothing, the bill dies. Two, you can pass the bill back and forth, where the Senate basically says to the House, hey, accept our bill. The House might say, yeah, okay. So let's pass it back and forth, or maybe you just make a slight change and send it back. Or you can go to what's called a conference committee. Under the conference committee, members from the House and the Senate get together, they work out the differences, and then both chambers pass on this like new revised bill. or vote on the new revised bill. So it has to be the same exact version. If they can't reconcile the differences, the bill dies. If it is reconciled, the bill goes to the president. The president has some choices: sign the bill into law. Trump likes to sign the bill with his big Sharpie. You could ignore the bill. If the president ignores the bill, there's two possibilities. If Congress is in session, president ignores the bill for 10 days, it actually becomes law. It's called a pocket pass. Pretty rare, it happens every once in a while. Alternatively, if bill passes, and Congress adjourns before the 10 days are up, the bill fails. There's a pocket veto. Excuse me. Or the president can straight up veto the bill. Congress can override a veto with 2/3 vote in each chamber. And if the override is successful, the bill becomes law. Or, the president signs the bill, it also becomes law. So sort of to sum up here, there's a big bias against action. It's much easier to kill a bill than to pass one. That's because there's all these different steps. Again, think back to the median voter lecture. We have to get through, and actually the median voter lecture can be more complicated because I ignored committees. So you could have a committee vote, and then the chamber vote, and then the other committee and the other chamber and the other chamber vote, and the president. There's all these places where the bill can die. So you need the sustained sequence of victories across the different chambers and the president. You only need to win at like one of these steps to defeat a bill. But again, I feel like today, the majority leadership has such a stranglehold over what gets votes, and that committees matter less. So we live more of a party world than a committee world than we used to. If a bill doesn't make it in one Congress, it can be reintroduced in the next one. So, a bunch of bills aren't going to become law in this Congress. We'll have an election, maybe we'll have a Democratic controlled Senate. So the bills that didn't become law now could become law later. So defeats are never final, but neither are most victories, right? So the Affordable Care Act became law, and then actually part of it got shut down in the courts. The Republicans tried to repeal it in the Senate or in the Congress, but they couldn't because McCain voted no. I remember he put his thumb down and said no. So defeats are never final, but neither are most victories. So that's the end. That's Congress. Thanks.